Listen. There is a small, persistent sound inside you that never quite goes away. It does not shout. It does not arrive with fireworks. It waits, patient and certain, to remind you of the one thing you most fear, that you are not enough. Tonight, let us sit with that voice and learn its language, not to punish it, but to understand how it was built, why it lives in you, and how, gently and with intention, you can begin to change its tune. Imagine a room where a child is learning to walk. Every stumble is met with a comment. Careful, you've always been clumsy. The child internalizes more than the words. They internalize a rule. That the world will note and sometimes laugh at their mistakes. Years later, that child becomes an adult who checks a message twice before sending it, who edits their opinions out loud and prefers silence over being wrong. That pattern is the architecture of self-doubt, a scaffold of repeated experiences and interpretations woven into a habit of mind that feels, to you, like truth. Self-doubt is not an accident. It is not moral failure. It is a learned strategy. It is a set of predictions your brain rehearses because once upon a time, those predictions seemed adaptive. When criticism was frequent, being cautious kept you safe. When comparison was constant, shrinking protected you from further exposure. Your nervous system learned that minimizing risk of humiliation or rejection was the way to survive. That lesson stuck. But survival is not the same as flourishing. There is a voice that speaks in the language of caution. It measures footprints, counts potential shame, and argues for invisibility. It will tell you that speaking up is dangerous, that trying is foolish, that your best is never quite enough. It feels like you because it uses your memories, your private moments, your most shameful misfires as evidence. It inhabits the same body as your hopes and uses your vulnerability against you. The first truth I want you to hear is this: the inner critic is a pattern assembled from pieces of your life. It is not the essence of who you are. We must separate provenance from personhood. Your past shaped a set of predictive habits, assumptions about how others will respond, about what is safe. Those predictions are not immutable facts. They are probabilistic responses that have been reinforced over time. The cognitive science here is precise. Our brains are prediction machines. They take past statistical regularities and use them to forecast future outcomes. If your historical environment contained many moments of criticism or invisibility, your brain will overweight negative social feedback. It will expect failure and thus act in ways that confirm that expectation, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. But prediction is not destiny. One of the most liberating ideas in modern psychology is that of plasticity. The brain rewrites itself in response to new experiences. New, repeated patterns will generate new predictions. When you deliberately create small, predictable experiences of safety, praise, and moderate risk that end in survival, or even unexpected success, your predicted map of the world begins to change. The inner critic, which thrived on certainty and repetition, finds itself with less reliable data and slowly loses its grip. Your perception of others' attention is a distortion we all share. Cognitive psychology calls this the spotlight effect. We assume we are more centrally visible to others than reality supports. This bias is not vanity, it is an anxious tether. When you believe everyone is watching, you rehearse potential mistakes over and over. You imagine microscrutinies you have never actually experienced. The remedy, in practice, is less about facts and more about experiential recalibration, repeatedly noticing that the imagined harshness rarely materializes. You will speak, fumble, and be met with indifference or sometimes with kindness. Those outcomes slowly teach the brain that exposure is far less catastrophic than imagined. Closely related is the impostor phenomenon, the persistent sense that success is owed to fluke rather than competence. It's common among high-achieving people because they are more self-aware and thus better at noticing the gaps in their knowledge. The sophist's paradox appears. The more you know you do not know, and the mind interprets that gap as evidence of fraudulence. The practical pivot here is to distinguish between epistemic humility, knowing there is more to learn, and existential fraudulence, believing you do not deserve the credit you have. You can cultivate a record-keeping habit, catalog small wins, document feedback, and anchor external evidence that contradicts the imposter narrative. The brain needs counterspeech more than it needs platitudes. Comparison is a slow poison because it is a social metric with no fixed yardstick. When you compare, you measure your inside against another person's highlight reel. Social media accelerates this distortion into a daily ritual. But comparison also reveals an underlying cognition. You compare to someone because you sense that version of them is within the realm of possibility for you. That is not always toxic. It can be signals of potential. The distinction lies in function. If comparison motivates strategic growth, it can be useful. If it corrodes self-worth, it is destructive. A skillful practice is to convert envy into curiosity. Ask what specific, reachable steps could move you towards what you admire, rather than concluding that you are inherently inferior. Self-doubt governs behavior through subtle economies of avoidance. It saves you from imagined catastrophes by narrowing your range of action. You choose smaller relationships, safer projects, more conservative goals. Over time, this economy compounds into a life where risk avoidance becomes the habit, and possibility's edge dulls. Yet the real cost is not failure, it is the atrophy of aspiration. The long-term consequence is not the absence of mistakes, but the absence of attempts that might have mattered. The antidote is graduated exposure. Expand your comfort zone by deliberate, incremental steps that are slightly uncomfortable and verifiably survivable. We must also examine how emotions are misread as facts. Shame, fear, and embarrassment are felt intensely, and thus often mistaken for truth. When you feel ashamed, your brain concludes you must be flawed. When you feel anxious, you interpret that as evidence of risk. The emotion is a signal, not an identity. Translating emotion into data, identifying its trigger, its physiological rhythm, and its narrative turns it from a verdict into information. This is the core of emotional literacy. Naming what you feel reduces its implicit authority. Language matters because the words you use to describe yourself create cognitive grooves. I am a failure is an identity statement. I failed in this task is a descriptive event. Identity statements are stickier and more invasive. Practicing precise language, speaking about behaviors, choices, and contexts rather than fixed traits, releases many of the cognitive anchors of doubt. Say, I did not achieve this outcome, rather than, I am not capable. Precision in language is not mere semantics, it is a therapeutic intervention. Now consider the social architecture that sustains self-doubt. Human beings are meaning-making animals. We interpret others' silences, smiles, and tones, and weave them into narratives that often reflect our worst fears. When someone does not respond to a message, your mind drafts entire scenarios of rejection. When a compliment is offered, you may reject it because accepting it would require revising your internal story. To alter this, practice a simple observational technique. Treat social signals as ambiguous and episodic, rather than definitive and global. The same silence can mean many things: distraction, mood, busyness, not necessarily dislike. Learning to tolerate ambiguity weakens the power of internalized negative narratives. Self-compassion is the fulcrum of change. It is not self-indulgence, it is a recalibration of internal feedback. When you treat yourself with curiosity and kindness, you introduce an alternative voice that competes with the inner critic. Neuroscience shows that self-compassion moderates stress responses and increases resilience. How do you practice it? Begin with micro-rituals. When you make a mistake, name the experience with empathy. I am having a hard moment. And pair it with an action that soothes or corrects without harshness. Replace punitive loops with corrective, supportive loops that guide behavior without damaging identity. Habits are formed through repetition and reward. If your default tends to be self-criticism, it was reinforced by some payoff, perhaps over-precaution that prevented social ostracism, or silence that avoided conflict. To create new habits, identify small wins that reward the new behavior. For example, if speaking up in a meeting causes anxiety, start by offering one succinct, low-risk contribution. Notice the outcome. If it's neutral or positive, allow that data point to exist. Repetition of small successes creates a reservoir of corrective evidence for the brain. There is a moral dimension that often remains unspoken. Many people who doubt themselves carry a secret moral code that equates humility with worthiness. They believe modesty should be practiced to the extreme, and loudness is vanity. This code can be valuable when balanced, but it becomes pathological when it prevents authentic self-expression. Reframe humility as the capacity to be truthful about your limitations and your strengths simultaneously. Authentic humility is neither self-effacement nor boastfulness. It is seeing yourself with sober clarity. Another practical lever is ritualized feedback. Construct a framework where you seek external, structured feedback that is specific and selectable. Generic praise is less useful than concrete, behavior-focused feedback. Ask a trusted colleague or friend to note 2 things you did well and 1 thing to refine. Externalized, objective feedback provides a counterweight to the inner critic's selective memory. Let us consider identity work. People often anchor their self-worth to roles: the worker, the partner, the parent. When one role falters, global worth plummets. The corrective is to develop a multifaceted identity. Cultivate interests, relationships, and values that broaden your self-definition. When your self-worth is distributed across several domains, the failure in one area becomes less catastrophic. It is not about fragmentation. It is about resilience built through diversification. We also need to talk about the tempo of transformation. Change is not a cinematic montage. It is an incremental realignment. The brain updates on statistical evidence. Thus, meaningful change requires repeated, sustained experiences that contradict old predictions. A single success can be memorable, but often insufficient. The strategy is consistency. Small, slightly ambitious acts repeated until they rewire expectancy. This is the science of habit formation applied to belief revision. There is a spiritual logic as well. When you surrender the illusion that you must be flawless to be deserving, you open space for vulnerability. Vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It is the pathway to genuine connection, creativity, and meaning. People who live with chronic self-doubt often avoid vulnerability because it feels like exposure. Paradoxically, practicing vulnerability in safe contexts recalibrates the nervous system to tolerate and even reward honest disclosure. How do you design those safe contexts? Intentionally. Choose relationships where reciprocity is evident, where curiosity replaces judgment, and where small disclosures are met with validation. Practice sharing minor imperfections and note the outcome. Notice how most people respond with empathy, not condemnation. Over time, these micro-experiences create a new social template. The world is not the hostile audience you imagined. Cognitive reframing is a tool of precision. When a negative prediction arises, if I speak up, they will think I am foolish, test it by designing a controlled experiment. Offer a short idea in a meeting and observe, did the feared outcome occur? Often, the result will be less severe than imagined. This method turns hypothetical fear into empirical inquiry. The brain prefers data, and when you supply it, it adjusts its probabilities. There is value in narrative therapy, rewriting the internal story you tell about yourself. That story has chapters: origin, struggle, survival. Identify the plot lines that cast you as lacking and deliberately author alternative lines that acknowledge constraints without collapsing into shame. Replace the climactic belief, "I am not enough," with a more nuanced narrative, "I have been learning to be enough." This small linguistic shift, present progressive, implies growth rather than conclusion. Practice presence as a technological intervention. Self-doubt floods the mind with hypotheticals, what-ifs, and worst-case scenarios. Mindfulness practice trains attention to the present. It doesn't erase anxiety, but loosens the automaticity by which doubt persuades. Even short periods of focused breathing, naming sensations, or grounding exercises reduce the reactivity that fuels self-doubt. Presence is not avoidance. It is a way to create distance so that emotion informs rather than governs. Let us examine the social stratagems that can perpetuate or alleviate doubt. Curate your inputs. If your daily feeds fuel envy and comparison, adjust them. Surround yourself with voices that are honest about struggle and process rather than performance. Seek mentors who are candid about their failures. Their candor de-glamorizes perfection and shows the iterative reality of mastery. Resilience grows from small recoveries. When you experience a setback, practice rapid repair. Name the error, extract the lesson, and identify the next practical step. This reduces rumination and increases agency. The process of recovery itself is evidence you can mobilize resources, solve problems, and continue. Each repair is a data point that contradicts the narrative of helplessness. Physical habits matter too. Our bodies and minds are not separate. Sleep, movement, and nourishment influence the emotional baseline from which doubt arises. Chronic exhaustion amplifies negative cognitive biases. Regular sleep and moderate exercise are not self-care indulgences. They are neurobiological interventions that lower the amplitude of the inner critic's voice. Now, the ethical injunction, be patient and be rigorous. Change is compassionate work, but it is not sentimental. You will need kindness towards yourself and disciplined, repeated action. Keep a ledger of experiments. Celebrate micro-progress without inflating it into identity. Document the moments where you behaved courageously, offered an opinion, sent a message, applied for a role, so that when doubt speaks, you can present counter-evidence from your own life. Finally, there is a profound existential reframe. Meaning arises from participation, not perfection. The human story is not an audition judged by an impartial jury. It is a process of trying, failing, learning, and connecting. When you align your acts with values rather than with the chase for external approval, the measure of success changes. Success becomes fidelity to what matters, not the absence of failure. You are not an error to be corrected. You are an organism learning to inhabit a world that is uncertain and often unfair. Your doubt is a signal that you care, not that you are defective. Use that care as fuel. Orient your curiosity towards practices that produce new evidence. Speak when it is meaningful. Risk in measurable ways. Seek feedback with structure. And practice self-kindness habitually. Over time, your nervous system will record new statistics, and the inner critic will find less purchase. If there is one practical sequence you can begin right now, do this. Write down 3 instances in the past week where you acted despite doubt. Note the outcomes honestly. Then pick one small act for tomorrow that stretches you by one difficulty level, no more. After doing it, record what happened. Repeat this sequence for 30 days. You are not proving yourself to anyone, but your own predictive system. That system will update slowly, then suddenly. The change you seek is cumulative, not instantaneous. Hear this as an invitation, not a lecture. Show up for your life with curiosity, not with the verdict of your inner critic. Tenderness and rigor can coexist. Be precise with language, generous with compassion, and relentless with small experiments. The voice of doubt will not disappear overnight, but it will become one voice among many, one that you can acknowledge without obeying. In the quiet that follows this listening, place a hand on your chest and remember one concrete truth. You are learning. You have survived patterns that once made sense, and you are, right now, capable of making new ones. The architecture of self-doubt can be dismantled not by negation, but by accumulation, by the steady accrual of small, verifiable experiences that say otherwise. Build those moments, keep the ledger, and in the spaces between action and result, practice patience. You are not less, you are in progress.